It's great to welcome to the program today John Conley, who's an economics professor at Vanderbilt University and also chief economist and founder of Geeq. That's Geeq. John, it's so great to have you on today.
Thanks a lot for making the time.
So, just to begin with, let's start talking about there are different protocols that exist and have surfaced in the world of cryptocurrency generally. These protocols are often, although maybe less visible to the end user, some of the most important elements in how these blockchains and cryptos function at sort of the core level. So let's just like smooth into this by saying, what are we talking about when we talk about a protocol, and what are some of the protocols that exist?
A protocol is an effort to synchronize a distributed information system, in essence. Visa MasterCard has hundreds, perhaps, of places where it stores your transactions, and it would like them all to be synchronized so that when you try to make a charge, it knows immediately that you haven't exceeded your credit limit. If they're not synchronized, one server might know that you're overextended, and the other server might go ahead and give you credit anyway. Centralized efforts to synchronize things, well-known, well-understood problem in computer science. The challenge then is to say, suppose that we don't have a centralized controller. Can we achieve a consensus and a consistency of the state of data if we're having a bunch of servers and nodes that are run by people that we don't know, that are anonymous, that we don't have any particular reason to trust? How can we let that kind of disorganized group come to a trustworthy conclusion about the state of the ledger or the data? So that's the essential problem.
And can you say, for those who may not know this next part, why is it that this is so important for when you are dealing with a blockchain? In other words, there is something about a blockchain that necessitates such a protocol.
Sure. It's not restricted to blockchain. It's any data store, really, or any kind of ledger. The problem that you're probably referring to is double spending. And that is, if I can show you a copy of a bank statement, let's say, which could be a kind of a ledger, and it says you've got $2,000, and I say, great, I take your check. But then you show somebody else a copy, and that check doesn't appear on the bank statement. They'll say, well, great, you've got $2,000, I'll take your check. But then, of course, when you try to cash them at the bank, then they don't clear, and somebody has lost money. You've tried to spend that $2,000 twice. So you always want to have available to you the current state of the ledger, a canonical or a definitive state of how many Bitcoins, how many Ethereum, and so forth people have available.
So this gets us to some of the protocols that have existed already in the relatively young history of sort of modern cryptocurrency. Some in my audience might be familiar with proof of stake. Some in my audience may be familiar with the term proof of work. Can you talk about what are the contributions of those initial protocols to the crypto space, and then we can get to where are they maybe falling short?
Sure. So the original protocol that started this all was Nakamoto's proof of work. And actually, it's beautiful. It's just a beautiful piece of mathematics, solved a problem that was difficult to solve. Nothing but admiration. So what proof of work does is, in economics, we have this sort of notion in game theory that talks about burning money. So proof of work is a way of burning money. It's saying, we're going to write a ledger, we're going to write transactions on a page made up of $1,000 bills. And very expensive to make that page, and that's done through a lot of very expensive computational effort. That's the proof of work. So I write the page, it takes $50,000 a page to create the page, and then I glue them in a book that is impossible to reorder the pages. That's because of a hashing algorithm or recursive hashing algorithm, but that's a detail. But let's just assume that I can't reorder the pages. So I stack up these pages, and I get 50 pages deep into the ledger. And now somebody wants to go back and say, oh, I didn't really spend that money back there 50 pages ago. The only way he can make that fraud is to rip up 50 pages, each worth $50,000, make another set of $1,000 bill pages, and then change the transactions and glue them back up. So it becomes extremely expensive to alter the ledger. And that's how you get this idea of immutability. So the beauty of the Nakamoto protocol of proof of work is that it makes it extremely expensive to alter a ledger once it's been written. So that's great. Visa can simply say, nope, you owe me $50,000, $20,000, $80,000, anything they want, because they control the database.
So that gets us to
yeah.
a proof of stake, which is a different sort of protocol.
So proof of stake is very different. Proof of stake, the idea is that you have, it's a variant actually of a proof of authority, which is what IBM Fabric is based on. So the commonality is that you have a vote over people that are entitled to decide what's correct in a ledger. And with proof of authority, the reason you have a vote is because you're Bank of America or Deutsche Bank or Visa, you're an identifiable person or company that we think is trustworthy and would be penalized if it lied. Proof of stake attempts to do that with anonymity. So if I were to somehow stake tokens that are worth $50,000, $100,000, and then I were to be caught telling a lie, somehow manipulating the ledger, it might be possible to take that stake. It's called slashing. So I could punish you for your bad behavior. So in one case, I punish your reputation. The other case, I punish your balances. And so that's a method of trying to enforce honest behavior on the ledger.
So this gets us to your project, Geeq, which again is spelled Geeq, and the concept of proof of honesty. Can you talk a little bit about what are the limitations in the protocols we've been talking about so far that you're looking to resolve or deal with proof of honesty?
Sure. Okay. So they have a different set of problems, but essentially they're vulnerable. They're very good as far as they go, but they're vulnerable when they actually get into the real world. Proof of work has what's called a longest chain rule. So if I have a lot of computers and I'm working like crazy and I'm hashing and I'm using up a lot of electricity and so forth, then I get a long chain that's very hard to mutate. But the person that can control the chain is the person that controls the majority of the computational power, so the most of the hashing power. So this is called 51% Byzantine fault tolerant. If more than 50% of the nodes are dishonest, they can write anything they like. And the protocol says that's correct. Even if you can look at it and say, I didn't sign that transaction. The protocol says, well, it's the longest chain. Sorry, you must have. There's really no appeal from the longest chain rule. So should that be a concern? Well, the NSA could spin up its computational effort and in a second have more computational power than Bitcoin. China could decide that all of those servers, of which more than half, by the way, are in China, that they belong to the government and then manipulate the ledger. Or North Korea, or a hacker that had a worm that could control enough bots could also conceivably do it. So it's really not very secure if you're relying on permanent control of more than half of the hashing power. All it takes is a desire to destroy it. Now, the reason Bitcoin is probably safe, more or less, is that all it contains is Bitcoin. It's a lot of Bitcoin, $180 billion, not chump change. But at the end, it's just a bunch of people playing with cryptocurrencies. Oh, well, it doesn't really affect the economy in any meaningful way. So there's a sense in which the security guarantee, the cost of manipulating Bitcoin is sort of in proportion with the value of manipulating Bitcoin. So it has been attacked, and other smaller currencies have been attacked successfully, but it's not a devastating concern because of the use that it's put to. Proof of stake is different. In proof of stake, you have to have 2/3 of the staking, the stakers, the weighted value of the stake, being honest. So if you control more than 2/3 of the token, actually it's much less than that because not all the token is staked. And there are lots of different ways that one can design a proof of stake system, delegate a proof of stake. There's many variations. All they have to do is have enough money to control 2/3, at least for a time, of whatever staking majority is needed. And that's sort of plutocracy, right? Whoever has the most can do it. Okay, well that's troubling. And it turns out if you do the math, it's often not really that much that you need to stake and take over. The really troubling bit is this. If I were to take, I don't know, let's say EOS or you name any sort of proof of stake, Tendermint or something, anything at all, any proof of stake blockchain, and you were to put the New York Stock Exchange on top of that blockchain as a method of creating markets with tokenized stocks, now you've got $1 trillion worth of value living on that chain. And if I can take it over by burning 100 million or 200 million or even $1 billion, well, if I'm Russia, that's definitely worth the economic attack. So if you try to put proof of stake blockchain to serious use, you just open it up for attack. It's like if I keep a whole bunch of gold behind a picket fence, it's probably going to be stolen. So that's the weakness of proof of stake.
So then, in the sort of next iteration, we should talk about proof of honesty. How does proof of honesty work, and what does it bring to the table?
So what we do is we really completely reverse the security model. Proof of work, proof of stake, proof of authority, all are looking for, in some sense, honest majorities, sometimes 2/3, sometimes 50%. But there's a vote amongst people that keep the ledger. And so we hope that the majority is honest, and we hope we incentivize them to be honest. And we hope that there's no overriding incentive like, gee, I could destroy the New York Stock Exchange that makes them not want to be honest. So our approach is different. Our approach is, I'll spare you the details, but the sort of first major conclusion is that every individual node that keeps the ledger makes its own decision about which transactions are correct, valid. It updates the ledger state. And so each node maintains its own view of what is correct. So that's number one. And number two, as a user, you can query that node and say, prove to me that you're honest. And there are cryptographic ways you can do that involving Merkle proofs. So prove to me that you've maintained an honest ledger, you followed protocol. The node can do that, or it can refuse to do that. If it refuses to do that, you go to a different node. If it tries to prove its honesty and you can verify, and by the way, the verification is done with what's called a user client. So the user's not doing any math. The user client is saying, yeah, honest or not honest. So it just takes the data and tells you the answer. So the user makes a decision if this is an honest node. If it finds an honest node, it goes ahead and submits the transaction to the node. All right, we spin the wheel around and everything, that transaction is evaluated by each of the nodes, and then it gets to the nodes at the edge. Now, if I tried to buy a car from you and I offered you, I don't know, $2,000 for your car, I don't know what kind of car you drive, maybe it's more. But if I try to, if I try to offer you $2,000 for your car in Geeq, I make the transaction, and then you go look at the ledger that's being kept that has that transaction that credits you, and you evaluate if that's an honest transaction that is therefore canonical and correct. If it is, then you, as an individual, decide that you've accepted that transaction as finalized, and you give me the car. The key here is that every individual user is making a decision about any particular node's honesty. If there are, let's say, 100 nodes that are keeping this ledger, what if 80% of them were dishonest and tried to lie to you? Well, if I tried to pay you on a dishonest ledger, you'd say, well, it's not valid. I don't accept it. So the honest ledger is automatically invalid. It's like I were to, write a check on a cocktail napkin, or forge a $100 bill on a cocktail napkin and gave it to you, or write a title to your car, in crayon. Well, it's an obvious forgery, and no one would ever pay me for that title or accept that $100 bill. So you, as a user, are empowered to protect yourself from dishonesty. So to put this another way, we don't have a vote amongst potentially dishonest nodes to determine what the correct ledger state is. Instead, users at the edge are empowered to protect themselves. If you're fooled, it's because you didn't check. And so the end of that is we need only a single honest node to get an honest ledger upon which everybody can trade. And then that means there's no value in being dishonest, unless there's a way to actually get even better than that. But
And John, in the limited time that we have left, what is the mechanism through which Geeq will earn money? In other words, is it from transaction fees? Is it interest? What's that? How is that set up?
yeah, that's actually that's a great question that could give a very long and deep answer. So I'll give the answer first, and I'll say something else. The answer is we get money, we get paid through very small transactions fees. So we've set up the network to be extremely efficient. The messaging is extremely efficient. We don't use many fundamental computational resources to maintain this ledger. And as a result, we can execute a transaction for about 1/100th of a cent or less. Users pay that, and that money is divided between the nodes that do the validation, and Geeq gets a fraction of it as well. So we get paid if the platform gets use. We get 3/100ths of a cent, 3/1000ths of a cent every time. So it's only worthwhile if it's a very large volume. But that's enough to support the network. And it's important that the network be supported as it moves, because otherwise it's not sustainable. You have to have people being paid enough to make them interested in participating. So the deeper issue, I don't know if I should, if you'll leave me have another 30 seconds, is there are very, very serious problems with incentivizing nodes in proof of stake and proof of work and so forth to share information. Why should I, as a node that's in proof of stake, take the trouble to send you a whole bunch of megabytes that lets you look at the state of the ledger? I don't get paid for it. There's no mechanism within the system that pays me for providing information to users. And there's a bunch of other things that are similar that relate to information provision that again, it's altruism, it's a hope and a prayer, but there's no reason to do it. But Geeq internalizes those. We actually give, where there's a thing we want done, we create an incentive for the agent that has to do it to go ahead and comply.
Absolutely fascinating project. We've been speaking with John Conley, who's an economics professor at Vanderbilt University, also the chief economist and founder of Geeq. You can learn much more using the links down in the video description. John, really a pleasure speaking to you today.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm glad you took the time. I appreciate it.